Hello, beautiful people. You are listening to the Communal Table podcast, part of Food and Wine Pro. I'm your host, Kat Kinsman, and senior editor at Food and Wine. My guest today is somebody whose work is fundamental to me and to anybody else who gives a good damn about restaurants, because it is a beautiful match of journalism, excellent writing, and humanity, I'd say, as well. He also exhibits this on his podcast, Out to Lunch with Jay Rayner. He is the longtime critic of The Observer in London, and most relevant to this conversation right now, he has just released a book that he was in town, New York City, doing a one-man show related to last night. It is Jay Rayner's Last Supper. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
It was an absolute joy to see you on stage last night. I know that you had mentioned in your book that you intended to be an actor when you were young.
Well, I had an ambition to be an actor because my father had been an actor. Not very successful one, as he would say, but he'd worked in some good places. And my parents were obsessed by theatre, and by the age of 10, I had been backstage at every West End theatre because they knew people in shows. And I loved all of that. And the realisation was that an ability to remember lines and show off was not the same as being an actor.
But at the same time, last night, I was watching you up there and thinking, he can remember his lines. Not many critics could.
Well, I, in a way, it has come slightly full circle. Yeah. So, at some point we should probably deal with the idea of a restaurant critic who in the US is meant to be anonymous.
Yes.
And there I am selling tickets for the Come and See Me show, which is a different thing.
Right. And you're... let us not neglect this, holding it up to the camera for people who cannot see it. Here's your face on the cover of your absolutely brilliant new book.
Yeah. Well, it happened a few years ago that I started doing these one-man shows. It was actually an attempt to escape literary festival discussion panels.
Oh, dear God, because you also write fiction. You also...
Yeah, I do a whole bunch of things. So this is I think my 11th book. But I'd written a book called Greedy Man in a Hungry World, which is about genuine definitions of sustainability in the 21st century. And while being massively entertaining, of course, it's also quite pointy-headed. And I knew that it was fodder for discussion panels at literary festivals where they get someone who's going to disagree with you and you sit between two palms and two rubber plants. And I hate them. They bore me. I think they're reductive. I don't think they're clever. And so my solution was to come up with a one-man show using PowerPoint as a kind of second performer on stage. What you saw last night is the fourth of those shows because it built and built and built, and it's far more a piece of theatre than anything I've ever done. And it built around five anecdotes from my life.
Well, the staging of it, too, was so interesting because you move yourself to the side where all of a sudden you're sitting in a banquette that you are... Let's actually talk about what happens in the show for people who have not read the book yet. Yeah. This is a glorious book that has so many layers to it because I really like it. I like so many things about it because I do care about food, but it also really, really touches on morality and mortality.
Oh, yeah.
In a really profound way that I want to dive into. But there is a driving pursuit in this book, which if you could explain to people who are not familiar with it yet.
All right, so the pursuit, or I would even go so far as conceit, is that whenever I've done those live shows, I always have a question and answer session. And the one question I would get more often than any other was, imagine you're on death row, what would your last meal be? And I've always replied that I think I would have lost my appetite. Yes. And I got to thinking about the idea of last meals. It's a parlor game that we all play. You know, what would you have? When you think of all the genuine candidates, the suicidal, the terminally ill, not a happy bunch. And also not actually suited to eating a last meal. But the idea of what would you have if nobody was looking, it summed up your life. I thought it was a brilliant one and a great way to delve into the relationship between food, memory, and emotion.
Because if there aren't a consequence, if you're not going to be alive for very long the next day to deal with the consequences of it, shame goes out the window, guilt goes out the window.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, imagine myself in a bathtub full of, I don't know, smearable substances.
Yeah, sure.
Just that
you can go anywhere with it.
Yeah, gluttony.
Exactly. I mean, one of the questions I had last night at the live show, now I no longer get the question, what would you have for your last supper? I've dealt with that. But, somebody said that there was no mention of cheese.
Oh, yeah.
Which was a good question, because when I started working on the book, I drew up a list of what I thought would be chapter headings. And two of them got struck out. One was cheese and one was chocolate. Fine foodstuffs in their own way.
Absolutely.
But I didn't really have a deep emotional relationship, a memory to attach to them.
Yes.
And narratively, as a writer, I felt it necessary that those things that I pick on and identify had to come from somewhere within my story. It's as simple as that. I'm very interested in narrative as a writer. I always say I'm a writer first.
Yeah, well, you're a journalist first. I feel like a journalist and a writer, because you really do the forensic work on all of the things that you're delving into. Because
yeah. I'm sitting here and there is a notebook in my back pocket. There is always a notebook in my back pocket because I used to cover murders. I used to do politics, social policy, you name it. And I still, to this day, when writing restaurant reviews, I'm asking myself the question: what's the story here? Because a table, a chair, plate of food and a waiter is not going to propel 1,100 words. You need something more than that. And in the same way, with this book, I'm looking for the story behind the dishes that I chose. I can't just say, I like spare ribs. I do like spare ribs.
Spare ribs are great.
Spare ribs are a great thing. But I need to, understand, look back on myself. I mean, obviously, it's enormously self-absorbed, Kat.
But
staggeringly so.
But that there's a lot to it, though, because you have the ability and the funding and the privilege to be able to go out and explore this in a way that civilians cannot.
I am lousy with privilege.
Oh, dear God. I mean, we both are in a tremendous kind of way, and people can live in this vicarious way. And we will get into the difference between UK and US food criticism and restaurant criticism, but there is a service aspect to it in a way, because you were doing these things to make sure that people have the experience that they should, and not waste their money at places where it would be an emotional waste. You had touched last night on some sort of popular reviews and things, but I thought when you said Peter Luger, I thought you were going to say per se. That Pete Wells.
Well, that's a very interesting one.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in terms of Pete Wells of the New York Times, the per se review, where he knocked it down from 4 stars to 2, was a very interesting moment for you and I.
Extremely.
For you and for those of us in the food world who go, okay, Pete, that's really interesting. I suspect the Peter Luger one was rather more instructive for the readers.
True. Well, the per se one hit me on an emotional level in a way, because that was the most I'd ever spent on a meal. And I was depressed for a couple weeks after, because it didn't match up to this sort of hagiography that people had written for years and years and years.
One of the issues with dinner, with going to eat in restaurants, is the larger the bill becomes, the harder it is as a customer to admit to yourself that it wasn't all that.
Yes.
Because you are undermining yourself and your own choices. You end up looking back on it going, I feel like a fool. I feel like an idiot. I feel like I've been duped. The benefit of the professional critic is that we, are perhaps more able to step back and say objectively, no, this really isn't worth what is per se these days, $500 a head?
It ended up costing me, I think, nearly $1,000.
Did it?
Or something, like, with the wine.
Just think of all the other things you could have done with $1,000.
And I did think of that. And I had been not too long before that to Alinea, where I had spent $7 less and had a meal that I still think about on a regular basis, because it hit me on an emotional level. I wasn't made to feel like I wasn't spending enough money to be there, because
you were down the wine list.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of restaurants and food. Sometimes I find that people who don't do the job I do think it's just about the food on the plate, whereas restaurants at a particular level are about anticipation and memory. Heston Blumenthal of the Fat Duck in the UK is very, very good on the idea of anticipation. He says that with a major restaurant experience, the experience begins the moment you book it. And then you are spooling forward. And he's actually at various times built certain elements into that process. So you're sent notes and they ask you various things. And then you're left with the memories. And the best restaurants stop the world and give you your best version of yourself at that table.
And your companions.
Yeah.
All of that. But yes, you're absolutely right. The world melts.
Yeah, good restaurants are meant to shut the door on the world.
Yes.
And I'm a strong believer in that.
I fully subscribe to this, and I can see we're at a strange point in the culture in the US and in the UK, where many things are afoot right now, that it can be seen as indulgent to be going to restaurants, to be writing about food, about restaurants and things, and you get harped at by a lot of people like, what do you do? The world is burning. Why are you doing this? And like, people need joy still.
Right. Well, there are
fundamentally.
there are two things. One,
Yeah.
it is possible to hold two thoughts in your head at
Yes,
the same time.
It
is possible to say, the way they cut the ham on Iberico was a bit rough and not worth the money, and also be concerned about the war in Syria. You can hold those two thoughts in your head at the
Yes.
same time, and that doesn't make you a bad person.
Yeah.
I think one of the problems people have with food experiences is, because we need to eat to live, the idea of eating for pleasure becomes stigmatized. But really, you need to put it in the same category as a whole bunch of other experiences. And the example I give in the UK is that you don't get the same resentment from people who decide to spend, say, £200 on the experience of going to see a Premier Football League match, because in some way football is considered authentic, an authentic experience. I hesitate to get into class, but it's considered an authentic working class experience, even at £200 a ticket. Whereas restaurant experiences are, by their very nature, bourgeois, to use the old term, and therefore entirely deserving of our contempt. And my job, possibly yours, I won't speak for you, is to keep arguing that actually the most important things in life are normality and having the right to spend your money as you see fit. Now, there are stupid restaurant experiences.
Oh, thoroughly.
Which
I've
deserve
wasted
to be
plenty of money on those.
which deserve to be called out.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily down to cost. I've spent a lot of money on meals that were the stuff of memories, and that's how I like to build my memories.
Yeah.
And there are other ones that drove me insane and resulted in me writing rude words about them for the public to read.
But in incredibly delicious words. I do like a negative review, but the thing is, Pete didn't set out to. He was texting me a lot during the Per Se review because he knew my feelings on there, that I had been somewhat depressed for a couple of weeks after that experience, because I had gone in there and I think they discounted our table because we were 4 women. We did not go for it started, you were talking about class anxiety, because even though I do what I do for a living, I walk into restaurants sometimes and think, they're going to know that I am riffraff, that I don't belong here, that I grew up in Kentucky and went to a state school, that they're going to know that somehow. So I did bring in my own class anxiety there. But I also noted that they made a really awkward question about how much we wanted to spend on wine, and they could have done that infinitely more gracefully. And once we sort of gave them a per person price of how much we wanted to spend on wine, it was handled so not gracefully. We sort of realized, like, okay, we're getting perfunctory treatment there.
How dismal.
It was. and so Pete knew that. So he would text me after he went, and he ended up sending me a picture of himself outside Senor Frog's, that he also wrote a notable thing about it. And eventually we went to Senor Frog's. And
he wrote a delightful review of Senor Frog's, which was not kind of condemnatory. It was hilarious.
It was I've known him for 21 years. It's the happiest I've ever seen him. I brought along the movie actor Jason Biggs, and he is delightful. He is obsessed with food. And we ended up having balloon hats and dancing in a conga line. And I believe I
recall the reference in the review.
And so we ended up actually using Senor Frog's as a way that we refer to people. Would they join the conga line and deciding like who you want to eat with? And to me, that was more.
Here's a question, Kat.
Yeah.
Would Thomas Keller join the conga line?
We actually discussed that, Pete and I did. And he maybe at this point would, but he would do it reluctantly and stiffly.
Yes, I think that's probably the case.
Yeah, you would maybe have to get a few shots into him or something.
I have interviewed him, and I found him very agreeable. He was a good talker, very polished, very smart. I ate at Per Se a long time ago, and it was well, I'd say it was great. The can't remember a single thing I had.
That's the thing. I remember oysters and pearls. But I do know that I've had a million great sandwiches from Bouchon Bakery and Bouchon in Las Vegas, where it fascinates me that they had to change the service model because they originally did the sort of very formal service. And the clientele who come from all over, everybody ends up in Vegas at some point, me a lot, some people less. And
I haven't been for a while and I'm missing it.
Oh, I went in December and it's holding up. It's glorious.
Good.
But they realized that people thought that the servers were being standoffish by not talking to them, and they had to completely change the service model to say, like, hey, where are you folks from? How are you doing? To put them at ease, because it is a fine dining experience. Oh, I took a British friend of mine there, and he had the best black pudding of his life there, and he was absolutely gobsmacked by the fact that we're in a sort of fancy restaurant in Las Vegas, and they have absolutely nailed
Black pudding.
That
is impressive.
Yeah. And he was saying there has to be a British person back there in the kitchen somewhere.
Well, probably is.
Yeah.
I
mean, really, truly.
Yeah.
But as a restaurant critic, I'm fascinated by this. If you could break down what you do, people mistake all the time. They misunderstand my profession. I rarely write about food.
I do sometimes. It's funny enough, I was just proofing a review from Dublin. I sometimes review outside the UK. And it's very foodie because...
It's a great city.
This particular restaurant, what they're doing is quite intense and deserving of the attention. My job is not to sell restaurants, is to sell newspapers.
Yes.
Or the digital equivalent thereof.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes people get very, very cross with me when I say it like that. That does not mean that I should just be producing clickbait.
No.
But it does mean I am serving the readers, not the restaurants, and that I need to describe to them how much pleasure your money will buy you.
Yes.
That's the absolute point of the column. I need to do it in as entertaining a way as possible. That's no different to any other kind of writing. I always say, I teach a class occasionally, I always say, one of the first things I say is, nobody has to read a single thing you write, not even your mother.
True.
And your job is to make them read from the end of the first sentence to the end of the first paragraph to the end of the first page. I'm aware that in the magazine that I'm published in The Observer on Sundays in the UK, that the gardening column is on the next page. And I do not want you turning to the gardening column until you have read every word of me. But there's no way that I can sit there going, please read me, please read. I just have to make you want to.
Yes, you have to earn it every time. And you've been doing this for 20 years in this particular...
20 years. I know, I barely look old enough. Isn't that the case?
You were a fetus when you started. So
yeah, absolutely.
Here's where our Craig Claiborne comes into the mix. I want to read you a bit here. Put on the glasses. My eyesight has just gone to shit recently.
Yeah.
Made it a while.
Welcome, friend.
Yes. I made it to my mid-40s without it. So, but I'm interested in this. So toward the end of his career, he said, and to tell the truth, I was bored with restaurant criticism. At times, I didn't give a damn if all the restaurants in Manhattan were shoved into the East River and perished. Had they all served nightingale tongues on toast and heavenly manna and mead, there is just so much that the tongue can savor, so much that the human body and spirit can accept, and then it resists. Toward the end of my days as restaurant critic, I found myself increasingly indulging in drink. The better to endure another evening of dining out, I had become a desperate man with a frustrating job to perform. 20 years in, do you feel any of that?
No, and there is a good reason.
Yes.
I think, and it's very, very specific to the differences between UK and US. The poor old New York Times critic has to go to each restaurant 3 to 5 times.
It's brutal.
And that is brutal. That really is. Your body is not your own. Neither are your evenings. You're out every night, lunchtime, whatever you are. And you're returning to places you've already had a bad time and you have to go back. Whereas in the UK, and people got quite cross about this because I wrote about this for the Guardian US website. We go once. Yes. Generally, I might pop back if it's that kind of place where you can pop back. But if it's a full-on restaurant, I go once. Yeah. And my argument is the prices that restaurants cost in the UK, how many times do you need to go to really decide whether it's good or bad? You know. You absolutely know. There is another point as well, which is most American cities are one broadsheet newspaper cities.
Yes.
So you have the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Chicago Tribune, the Post. And that means you have one big name critic. I mean, obviously there are others in New York, but one big name critic. And that presents economies of scale, and it presents a service journalism role. In the UK, there are... I think I get a bit confused. Let's say 10 national newspapers, and at least 7 of them have restaurant critics. And we all cover the same waterfront, which means that instead of getting one person's view of a restaurant based on 3 visits, you are possibly going to get 5 different people's views of a restaurant based on 1 visit each. And we've just had that.
You was at Davies and Brooks? Is that
Davies and Brook is a new restaurant from Daniel Hum of 11 Madison. It's opened inside Claridge's, which is one of our fanciest hotels in town.
One of my favorite bars is there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he's opened this very serious restaurant where
Very serious.
Well, it's quite serious. They gave us the worst table. It was fantastic.
Do you get tired of serious restaurants?
Yes, absolutely. So we divide the restaurants we're going to review, The Guardian and The Observer, through an intermediary. There's one editor, and I say, can I take this one? And Grace Dent, who reviews for The Guardian, says, can I take that? And I did take Davies and Brook, but mostly because I felt it was time that I went back and did one of those sorts of restaurants. There are some people, I tend to call them napkin sniffers, who absolutely revel in that whole bow and curtsy of the grand restaurant experience. And can we present to you? You know, at Davies and Brook, they bring one of their dishes in an old wooden box. And basically, the food has been interred in a coffin before it arrives. I mean, it's a nice enough dish. It's congee with ginger and enoki mushrooms, and it's nice enough. But I think one of the things that reviewing on a regular basis helps with is, I'm really sorry, but I don't care how nice a box it is, that's not going to change my view of the food inside it.
Yes.
So I went. I did eat a couple of very, very fine dishes. There were a couple of dishes that coming out of that kitchen were some of the best I'd eaten in a very long time. But even so, I would not feel the need to go back.
There's a preciousness, I think, that I get exhausted by at some of these restaurants, and I feel in the US there's a move away from some of that.
Absolutely. I mean, I've just I've only been in New York for about 3 or 4 nights.
Yeah.
I've eaten out quite a lot, and it's all been in a kind of noisy, I would call it mid-market area, and the food has been terrific.
Yes.
I really, I've eaten 3 or 4 bang-on meals. Already, and I've got a couple more to go, and it's been, you know, I've been quite struck. One of the issues I had, I have reviewed somewhere here, was
I'm excited, and I sort of wonder if I know where that is.
No, you haven't got a clue.
You said Brooklyn.
Oh, did I? Yes,
you
I
said
did.
Brooklyn, and you also on Twitter responded to a friend of mine, and you said it was across the street from a restaurant in my neighborhood.
Oh,
so I think I know.
Oh, do you know my ex-editor then?
Wait, Sarah
Knight.
Yes, I have known her for many, many years.
Oh, right. I think then you probably have worked out exactly where I went. So the issue,
journalism, man.
It's journalism. Join the dots. It was a case of looking at the list that came my way from various friends and contacts, and saying, "Can I get something like this in London?" And the honest answer was, "Yes, we're very similar cities.
Yes,
in many ways." But the one thing I found I couldn't get was the one place I went to. There you go.
Okay. I'm very much looking forward to this, and I think I have it nailed.
No, you haven't nailed. You clearly do.
Because that is also the neighborhood that I have lived in since 1997 or 8. So.
Okay. Well, you've seen a few changes.
Oh, tremendous changes, and it's actually been a joy to see the evolution. And I've seen the crossover too, because there's a restaurant in the neighborhood called Stone Park that I love so deeply and fundamentally, and they had for a long time a marrow bone on there that was inspired by St. John, and I am such a St. John obsessive that after they came and did a pop-up at Barbudo, in 2010,
Yeah.
I got a marrow spoon tattooed on my ossobuco bone. It's I'm also a former metalsmith, so it makes sense. But they were just in.
Sorry, when you say you got a tattoo on your ossobuco, but is that a euphemism that I've misunderstood?
No, it's up my sort of shin bone.
Oh, I see. Okay, fair enough.
So it's nothing dirty. I swear, there's no double entendre there. But they also, to see the crossover of like, oh yes, clearly we've been to St. John's, and then they're suddenly doing it in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, and then we had the pleasure of Fergus and Trevor were just here in Brooklyn over the weekend doing a pop-up at the Hoxton here for their books. So I got to interview them over the weekend, and oh yeah, no, it was great. It was middle of the afternoon, so there were no cocktails first. But then they served the pies and it was such a joy watching a lot of people who had never had their pies before, and they're changing pies in each 4 cities, and they did a pigeon, bacon, and trotter here, and just watching my friends, some of whom had been to St. John and some of whom had not.
I'm kind of intrigued. How did they do that? Did they brought stuff
some
over?
They did bring some things over, and I think stealthily did some things. But they've also been working with all the chefs at the various Hoxtons there. They did chips. I don't know if it would measure up to your top chip of all time, as you said, but they were very wonderful.
Do we need to say by chips you mean fries? Will your audience understand?
Hopefully anybody listening to this podcast will know what that is. But to see that back and forth exchange, but to see the joy that people had who had not gotten to sit down at St. John. They serve the marrow bones. They serve that salad with anchovies that he calls the salad that saved my life. Is a beautiful thing. But to see that translation was such a lovely thing. But you were saying there were similarities between the two cities with some of these things. And I
think, so one of the main similarities between London and New York is that as rents and rates and wages have shot up in the centre, both cities have donutted. Which is to say, if you come to town, that obviously there are some great restaurants in Manhattan, but really you should be heading to Park Slope and Williamsburg and whatever. You should be heading out to what were previously considered the residential neighbourhoods. And in London, it's the same. Yeah. So there are some great restaurants in the centre, but the really interesting stuff, you're likely to find it in Peckham or Hackney or Dalston or Haggerston or Brixton, where I live, outside of the centre. And with that comes a certain confidence. Younger cooks, feeling able to do their thing. We have one downside. Here's a really specific,
do tell.
Specific reference. So younger cooks are no longer feeling they have to do 10 years in a grand restaurant before going off on their own, and so they're opening quicker and maybe opening with a short menu rather than a big expanse, and that's all brilliant. But the one problem I'm noticing is it means that many of them haven't done long enough on pastry. And so their dessert menus tend to be creamy things in a bowl. They write them beautifully.
You can always see a chef dessert where they have not.
They've not done time on pastry. So it will be a thing panna cotta with a thing gel with a thing whatever.
There's so many creme brulees.
There's creme brulees. There's chocolate mousses, and they write them beautifully. But you look at it and go, nah, it's a creamy thing in a bowl.
Fergus and Trevor did the Il Flottant when they were.
Well, that's a proper piece of work.
It was a really truly lovely.
Soft meringue and custard is marvellous.
Yeah, it was just about broke my teeth with the sweetness, but it was marvellous. Those madeleines, how were glorious. But the other thing that I'm seeing with some of these young chefs is that and this is a problem that has come to the forefront in the US and in the UK, where some of these chefs are seeing the abuse that the previous generation was having in the kitchen. There are low wages and you're being physically and mentally abused, and a lot of them are turning their backs on it and saying, I know you went through it and you're trying to perpetrate this abuse, but I don't have to deal with this.
Well, you've written extensively about this. I came up behind, was playing catch up, and I've written a couple of big pieces.
I thoroughly appreciate that you have.
For Observer Food Monthly, and we've started sort of talking seriously about mental health issues in the hospitality business.
Thank you for doing that.
Well, it has to be done. I mean, there is a disconnect. What goes on behind the kitchen door should not be abusive or detrimental to the mental health of the people you're paying to do it. And we know that too much kitchen work is low pay. The hours can be appalling. And even though we also know that kitchens can be a sanctuary for a group of people
Absolutely.
who perhaps haven't fitted in elsewhere.
And that is the beautiful pirate ship part of it.
Yeah, but it is not an excuse
Mm-hmm.
for terrible abusive behaviour. I get a bit reflective in the book, in the Last Supper book, about this, because I think the whole Me Too issue abuts this, particularly in the restaurant business. You know, I went out for a night with Mario Batali, and he behaved appallingly, and I thought I would just write it very tidily and tightly and cleanly, and he'd hang himself with his own words. But in fact, I think I maybe just built into the myth of who he was.
I think we're all struggling with that, about how we covered some of these people. I covered him over the years. I covered John Besh. I covered various of these people who've been called out for this. And it's definitely factored into who and how and what I write about. And I've of course had to think of, like, who have I been complicit in writing about? What did I just laugh off because I thought I had to? I was thinking about particular strange nights that I had at the Spotted Pig, and there was a very strange night in that particular room where
the room at the top with the code on the number code on the door.
Yeah, and Marco Pierre White bit me. And I was thinking, like, and I laughed it off because I was sort of,
because it's Marco, and that's hilarious.
And I'm thinking, like, no, and he was actually weirdly not even the only chef who bit me. The other one bit me on the arm, and I had a bruise for a week, and I had to just kind of, and then tried to get me to go shag him in the bathroom, and I'm like, no, but I had to and I was thinking, where was I complicit then in sort of laughing it off and things? So it's very much at the front of what I do. I was hearing a story. I had spoke at a conference in Galway, Food on the Edge.
Yes,
spectacular group of people talking about a lot of things. And somebody got up on stage and told a story about a chef who was still working in London. And he had a strange thing where he had all of the cooks line up, and they would spit in the porter's face every day. And it was a god-awful sort of thing, and the cooks now are having this reflective moment saying, well, I did that. I fell in line behind it.
Yeah.
When you start to learn these things about these chefs, what is your take currently on if you cover them, if you don't, if you go to their restaurants, how you...
I'm very clear. There are a number of chefs who I will not write about.
Yeah.
I won't review the restaurants.
Yeah.
There's a guy, and I'm very comfortable saying it, there's a chef in the UK called John Burton Race, who went all the way to 2 Michelin stars and has had a rackety life. And he's about to publish his memoir, so he'll probably be delighted that I'm talking about it.
Yeah.
I think he is an appalling human being. I've had conversations with him where he has said things that I find repugnant and repulsive, and I will not go and review another one of his restaurants.
Yeah.
And there are similar chefs that I know things about, and I will not go and review them.
Yeah.
I would prefer to be able to go further.
Yeah.
Which is to say why I won't review them, and sometimes I do very explicitly, but I won't put you through the whole compliance issue of what those things are.
I used to work at CNN.
Right. Okay. So I won't place you in that position.
Yeah.
We have been. It's one of the interesting questions. So, Observe Food Monthly is our monthly food mag.
Yeah.
And we've long had the conversation in London going. So, in various bits of the US restaurant industry, people have been named and shamed, and their behaviour has been called out. And we haven't been able to do that in the UK for a very simple reason. It requires very brave people to come forward and go on the record. And people did go on the record here in New York.
For the Spotted Pig especially.
In the UK, and it drives me insane.
But I had a guest on the podcast some weeks back, Trish Nelson, who was one of the people who worked at Spotted Pig and was one of the people in the lawsuit. And she put her career and her life in jeopardy, standing up and speaking out about this. And, they emerged, in theory, victorious in some ways, but then ended up getting absolutely screwed because they were entitled to future earnings from the restaurant, and Ken Friedman shut it down. And so they're actually currently trying to find investors to buy the place and reclaim it.
So is the Pig just closed? It's just a shutter building.
Yeah, it is. It is gone right now. The restaurant part of it, and then I think there's maybe residential in the rest of the building. But it's a really complex matter of ownership. Jay-Z owns part of the building along with maybe 20 other people. It's a huge rat's nest of legal things. But they want to take it and reclaim it, and I fully champion their efforts to do so. And I think if they can do that, even in another space, and they were calling it something like the vexed sow or something like that. They were trying to figure figure out another name for it, which I think is very, very funny. But this sort of reclaiming of power, and I think we're in a phase of a lot of these people are trying comebacks. I know I will not be complicit in whatsoever.
It's interesting. We've had one particular guy in London who had left the business that he was involved in, and then quietly tried to launch a restaurant.
Yeah,
and there was a kickback in which people, I mean, I don't know. Maybe he's launched it and maybe it's doing fine, but there was a strong feeling that he hadn't really apologized for his own behaviour.
Yes. Yeah. There is definitely that, and some people have done the work, and some people very clearly have not. And I think especially journalists are in a phase right now where we have to assess, like, is this thing genuine? Also, who left the business because you behaved in this particular way? Shouldn't they get their chance now?
Sure.
And I think that's a really compelling thing. So, but it's interesting as a food journalist at this particular point, because we're in this phase of having to deal with people's pain and destruction and stuff, and still having pleasure, and that is.
Well, you see, again, I don't think that the two things cannot exist.
Yeah.
There are still great restaurants and great people running restaurants and great cooks and people behaving brilliantly. So I have a podcast called Out to Lunch.
Yeah, it's a joy. People subscribe.
Yeah, please do.
We'll put the link in there. And I love the conceit of the podcast.
Well, so the conceit is I take a fabulous person out to lunch in a restaurant, and we order, and then we talk. And my job is to have researched them to such a granular detail that over the 2 hours, it only runs for 45 to 50 minutes. I can get serious chat. I did one here with a British comedian called Ramesh Ranganathan, who, as we speak, he's about to go and perform at the Soho Playhouse. So he was in town on a bit of a loose end. So he thought he'd come and talk to me. And I did that at Crown Shy, down on Pine Street.
Yeah.
Is it James Kent?
James Kent, who had been at EMP.
And the thing that really struck me, and we talked about this briefly, James and I, was the massive open kitchen.
Yeah.
There are you can have partially open kitchens. No, this is a seriously open kitchen. It's part of the dining room.
Oh, goodness.
And I said one of the things I thought was really interesting is that it had started to alter behaviour.
Absolutely has.
Because you cannot mistreat your cooks in front of your diners, because your diners will watch. I mean, obviously your cooks, your brigade also have to behave in certain ways. They're going to have to watch their hygiene habits very, very closely. But he did say, he said, I mean, that's absolutely true. It moderates behaviour, which is a very good thing. Although he did say that he knew of certain chefs who'd learned to stamp on their cooks' feet in a way that couldn't be seen in open kitchens. He wasn't talking about himself, obviously. I thought, Christ, there's always a way round it, isn't there?
Yeah, people are going to be shitty if they are shitty people, and that's just going to happen. But back to pleasure here. It's such a glorious through line, along with sort of mortality in the book, and I see you weighing the morality of eating animals, which it's a wonderful point of reflection in the book, because you talked about, because you have very much written about sort of the ethics of food and consumption and the impact on the world and all this kind of stuff. It's a lovely moment in there too, but you're also, people around you are people close to you are dying while you're on this pursuit, and pleasure is such an important part of being human.
Yeah.
And it makes us feel most human. And having these moments to get together with people and share, because you're also talking about the people who you are eating with along the way, the people who you end up eating with, and having these moments of, there is not life unless there is something to really love in it.
One of the challenges I think we all experience these days is living in the present tense. Yeah. We're playing forward a lot of the time, or thinking back. And the older I get, the more I try wherever possible to think, enjoy this.
Yes.
Enjoy where you are right now. Because if you can't enjoy now, what's the point?
Yes.
Life is more than memories and anticipation.
Yeah.
And that's another thing I love about restaurants, really. They are about the now. And the now is very, very important. It's also, I have to say, I have this sideline as a jazz musician. I play jazz piano with a quartet. And the brilliant thing about being a musician is you are constantly in the now. You can't be anything other
You
than
can't afford anything other than that.
Than the now. And that's one of the things I adore about it, working with other musicians. You're all right there in the moment.
And it's so collaborative, too. Writing can be incredibly lonely. But going to restaurants can be a wonderful thing and sort of a thing of pressure. I see Pete having to deal with this because you have to make conversation with people unless you're I love eating alone personally. But
no, I'm big on eating alone as well.
Yeah, really,
but that
really.
actually is another challenge that the big American critics face in having to go 3 to 5 times. Not only they have to do it, they have to find someone to come with them.
Yes, it is.
I'm sure that's incredibly challenging. Even I've got some good friends.
Yeah.
But they're all sort of, oh God, no, I can't. No,
Yeah.
thank you, I've done it. I've been there. I don't want to go for dinner again with you.
Because there are rules to it too. Like when you eat with Pete, there are particular sort of things that you have to do, and it's.
I only have a couple of rules.
Yeah, what are they?
I might try and compare them with compare notes with Pete when I meet him. So one rule is obvious, which is that I get to try everything on your plate.
Yes. Yeah.
But the main rule is that my companions have to understand. People listen to this and think you're a monster, but here it is.
Yeah.
I want them there for their companionship.
Yes.
I am not at all interested in what they think about anything.
Yes.
Because I am the one writing the column, not them. They can tell me what they think, and I'm quite a nice, polite, and open chap, so I'll listen. But generally, I'm not really interested. But this applies to something else, which is, at some point, the waiters, the front of house staff, will ask you how everything is, how did you find that? And my dining companions are instructed to answer with one word, the most passive-aggressive word in the English language, fine.
Oh, God.
Now, they may find that rude or bleak or uninformative, but it gives me room for maneuver. What I do not want is one of my companions saying, this is brilliant, this is the best thing I've ever tasted, when I'm the one who actually has to write the column.
Right.
So I'd prefer for the restaurant to be left a bit baffled than to get mixed messages and the wrong messages.
I like that. That would make me. I'm such an effusive person, and I always want everybody to feel okay. And I was like, "Oh, this is wonderful. This is."
Do you do that? I mean, clearly you've reviewed with Pete.
Yes.
And does he give any instructions on?
No, it's mostly about sort of sharing the things, and I am always deeply amused to call him by his pseudonym, whatever he's booked it under throughout the whole kind of thing. But,
except the thing is, I mean, again, I'll talk to him when I finally meet him. I do wonder in a city like New York, in the age of the web, how anonymous he really is.
He changes his look all the time, which is very fun. So when he came on the podcast, it was not video. But the funny thing is, though, I'm pretty recognizable.
Really?
Yeah. I usually wear my hair up in a bun too. So, but then the damnable thing here is, then they can come and then they use it as an excuse because they know who he is. Generally, so he's not always made, but generally. But then they can come and sort of fawn at me, which I actually fucking hate. But because they can't do it to him, they do it to me, and that way they can sort of do all the things. And I don't love extras and all that kind of stuff. Like, I just want to eat what I ordered, like for the most part. I also have a lot of dietary restrictions. I'm dealing with an ulcer right now,
right? Okay,
which like really sucks. So so it's actually like pretty hard for me. And if all these things show up, I can't actually eat them, or else I'm going to feel like shit, and I'm going to hate your restaurant.
Yeah, I mean, people don't understand the trials.
Yeah,
the trials, Kat, the difficulties, the fight for just having dinner. It's the hell. The job that I do, it's just...
The thing is, like, I know it sounds like huge, like, problems of privilege and stuff, but
my diamond pumps are pinching.
But it is one of those things where, like, I can't physically, like, eat this kind of stuff. And then, of course, because I like I said, I always want everybody to feel okay. I don't want to hurt the chef's feelings. I don't want to do this thing. So sometimes I'll eat something that is, like, uncomfortable, but then it's going to associate a negative memory with a restaurant. And I don't want that for them. I was at a friend's restaurant before I came to your show last night, and we were just sitting there. We were just catching up, and she was saying, like, oh, can we get you anything? And I said, I love your food so much, but I can't eat anything here right now because I'll feel sick.
By any chance just 2 blocks around the corner?
It was pretty close. It was Beatrice Inn, which I love so deeply. But I knew that I would feel sick if I ate the things, and I said, I adore you, and said, but I can't do this because I don't want to have a negative memory associated with your restaurant. So I just drank a very non-alcoholic ginger drink, and so I could just enjoy. I could just enjoy being there. You're going through this, and you're actually worried about your own self because sleep is a
well. That's an interesting subject. Yeah, and it, so Well, the phrase is, I suffer from sleep apnea. Actually, I don't anymore because it's fully treated.
Good. I'm so glad to hear that.
Sleep apnea, for anybody who doesn't know, is when your airways collapse and you stop breathing, and then your body shocks you awake.
Yeah.
And this can happen a lot.
Yeah.
And I was clearly snoring a lot. My wife would know this, and we ended up sort of sleeping apart a lot of the time, and it wasn't very happy. And so there is a narrative strand in there, particularly because one of the symptoms of apnea is your body almost mimics death.
Yes.
You know, your breathing stops, and then it starts again. And so I started. The narrative is, you know, this middle-aged man going and getting himself examined and treated and staring mortality in the face. I'm 53.
You're exactly my husband's age.
Right.
And he has been through the snoring.
Oh, is he? Right. And I carry a bit of extra weight. I always have. And so the question was, had I done this to myself? As it happens, 40% of men over 40 suffer from sleep apnea. But it became a very intriguing thing to investigate. And then finally, you come to a point where you get a piece of kit that keeps your airways open. And so I no longer suffer from sleep apnea because it's treated.
Yeah.
But I was in quite a bad way.
It's lack of sleep is a really debilitating thing. I actually ended up going to my doctor a few years ago. I was worried there was something neurologically wrong with me because it runs in my family, and I was feeling dizzy. I was almost falling down. And she told me, no, you actually have just a severe sleep deficit and you need 6 months of quality sleep. And I was like, right. Okay.
How did you get it?
It's been a lot of work. At that point, I sort of ignored it, and because I had a book to finish, I had a new job to start, I had all of these things in front of me. So finally, over the last half year, I've started doing meditation and some medication for ADHD, which turns out was behind a lot of the anxiety stuff. Medical marijuana, which is, I have a state legal card for it. Yeah, lucky me. And
I think it takes a bit of the joy out of it, doesn't it?
No, I'd never done it before.
Had you not?
No.
Oh no, I was a stoner in my teens.
Everybody always assumes I had because I went to art school and everything, but no, I'm a
Actually, I describe that in the book as well, don't I?
Yeah.
I'd stopped after too many magic mushrooms, age 19. I'd gone through all my narcotics in my teens and then stopped.
And then Thunderbird later.
Oh, Thunderbird. Now, that was a moment. So, in Blue Label Thunderbird, which is terrible stuff.
Oh, God. It's
rough as an old dirt track.
I actually almost brought you a bottle today that it was actually too busted because I had put it in the backyard in the snow to keep it colder at one point. Because there's Thunderbird, and then there's the other word, Night Train. And one says drink cold, the other one says drink very cold. And I'd put it in the snow and the label had fallen off, so the impact would be gone. But I almost brought that bottle up.
But what was quite striking, so I do that moment in the show in the UK.
Yeah.
And somewhat larger audiences, obviously sort of 500, 600 people. And I get a ripple of appreciation.
Another fine wine.
from certain bits of the London audience or the British audience. New York, that audience went, oh my God. He drinks Thunderbird?
It's a particular moment. And I mean, I'll say that what I especially appreciated about the dishes, I will not reveal the dishes that you picked other than Thunderbird here, because you really should go on the journey with him through this book.
You really should, yes. Buy it now.
Yeah, buy it. Get the. I assume you read the audiobook?
I did read the audiobook.
Okay, good. Yeah. Which is always a weird thing to have to do. I did my own, and it's a weird thing. Yeah. But it is, it's a fantastic journey. But so many of these things, people assume a lot of things about restaurant critics. They assume it about food journalists in general. People always assume I'm a restaurant critic. I'm like, no, actually, I'm not one. But people assume that everything is pinky up and fancy and all those kind of things. A lot of what you picked is not fancy.
No, it's not.
It's homey.
It is. And I think the reason is that, as say, it's about attaching memory, emotion to foods. And those really showy ingredients, the foie gras, the Chateaubriand, all of that sort of stuff, well, they're so pleased with themselves. It's all a meal with those involved is all look at me, look at me, look at me, look at me, and there's no space in which to have an emotion attached to them, which is why you're right. It goes to humbler things. Well,
like foie gras, like Mum used to make.
Yeah. The foie gras torchon like my mother used to make. It just doesn't. It isn't the way, is it? That's not what people make at home.
No.
And so it is humbler stuff.
And somebody, there's an element of addition there that somebody was questioning you on last night. I think and can reveal like one aspect of a dish. They were saying, well, processed white bread. And I loved your answer to it because one of my favorite things in the world is a tomato sandwich during the summer. Tomato, mayonnaise, crappy white bread. I loved what you said about sourdough. Artisanal sourdough doesn't make the best sandwich.
No, it absolutely doesn't. The nearest you come is an open sandwich where the sourdough is used as a pedestal. Now, don't get me wrong, I love a good sourdough.
Oh, dear God, yes.
And, there are sourdough wars going on in London.
Oh, here in the States, very much too.
Yeah,
it's culty.
Each restaurant trying to prove that they've got the best one and so forth. But no, it's not great for a sandwich. You need pappy white bread.
Yeah, there was somebody, when I still worked at CNN, my colleague and I had a ritual that every summer, she's from the South and I'm from the South-ish in Kentucky, and we would ritualize that we would make these tomato sandwiches. I would grow the tomatoes usually and bring them in, and we would have, white paper plate and squishy white bread and Duke's mayonnaise that we brought from the South and have these tomatoes. And a colleague was sort of watching us, and she said, white bread, I think we specifically had like Wonder Bread or something like that. And she said, that isn't very foodie of you. And I thought, if you don't understand what we're doing here, you get no tomato sandwich.
Yeah, so you're not going to have this. Well, that's the thing, the perception that you are in some way, just about the little pinky rays.
Yeah.
Nah, it's all of it.
I think of the best meals of my life, and a few of them are at some of those fine temples of dining that, I went to Alinea and had a deeply emotional meal, and some of that may have been tied up, actually probably very much with the fact that my cousin had died at 40 earlier that day, and I was in a very
You
emotional...
were celebrating life.
Yeah, it very much was. I've had a couple of meals at Stone Barns, but we were also commemorating experiences too, because one of them in particular, my husband got ordained to marry friends of ours, and it was the 10-year anniversary of our first date, and it was now their wedding anniversary, and it was such a special occasion because we did it just in the grain silo there,
right?
And because the friend who was getting married had been maitre d' at Danielle for 1,000 years, so they did him a favor and let us have this for free, as opposed to the $1 million, whatever it was that we usually, and we walked to the kitchen after it was done, and they stopped service and they banged on pots and pans. So I have this deeply emotional memory of that, and that's a high-end thing. But otherwise, I'm thinking of barbecue places that I've been to, and like soul food restaurants with really deeply cooked okra and things like that. These really humble meals are things that friends have cooked for me. And when I... in US.
The interesting thing is that one thing doesn't exclude the other.
Not a bit.
And liking one thing does not exclude you from liking the other.
Yeah.
It just means that the higher the price rises, I think the more you have to attend to the quality of the experience in all its forms.
Yeah, and there's the anxiety that goes with that too. Am I worthy of this, thing that has happened? And I realize I sometimes get a little resentful at some of these restaurants because I look around at the obviously very wealthy people and think like, it's just Thursday to them.
Yeah.
And I remember going...
Now you see, I have this issue.
Yeah.
You mentioned Stone Barns, which is clearly close to your heart.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be controversial here.
Do it.
Okay. So Dan Barber is very, very intense about his mission and the sustainability of his restaurant. Mm-hmm. But I have this thing that I think you really have to take the sustainability, the footprint of a restaurant in the round. Yeah. Now, in my book, Greedy Man and the Hungry World, I've looked at this, and the whole of a carbon footprint is defined by the whole life cycle analysis. And with a restaurant, that includes the customers that you attract. Mm-hmm. Now, I think if you took a satellite shot of the car park at Stone Barns, you would see lines of Lincoln Town cars that have come in from Manhattan.
Yes.
So that the carbon footprint of this sustainable restaurant would be vast, because I don't know what the tasting menu there is these days.
It's not cheap.
Yeah. If when you're selling these meals for a few $100 a head to people who've come in with gas-guzzling cars from all the way from the Upper East Side, you've got a problem.
Yes.
And one of the things I've become deeply suspicious of is the way that certain chefs have expanded this mission to look after the planet when really they're making dinner for rich people.
It's interesting. I was thinking about this a lot when I was having dinner there recently, and for me, it's every few years treat to get to go and do this. It's not just Thursday. It's something that you planned for months because also you have to.
I have to say, this doesn't mean the restaurant isn't terrific.
Yeah. But I was weighing this a lot in my head while I was doing this, because it's an intensely privileged thing to be able to do. It's astoundingly expensive. And I was thinking, okay, what is the sort of moral thing here? And he said something to me in the kitchen that I really appreciated. We were tasting through a few of the things where he's trying out the seeds for it, because he has row 7 seeds that he is trying to breed for flavor and breed for things that have been bred out of food so it was more easily transportable and things, and he's trying to bring that back. And he said the end goal of that is he wants these seeds to be at Walmart. And I thought,
well, that's admirable. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's going to be a while before you get there too. It's an interesting thing. We're actually working on a piece about these restaurants that have a mission to them and stuff, but who's the mission for? Who does it benefit? Kind of thing. And what I like about that restaurant is because it is confounding in so many ways. Because yes, they have this mission to save the planet and stuff, but is that done by that? But who are there kids from underserved neighborhoods who are getting to go up there and be in nature? If so, what does that particular day do for them? How the people who work there treat
it's a little bit like, I would say, in the way it needs to be looked at. Certain restaurants that have been accused of being abusive.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of critics who said, I am not interested in what goes on behind the kitchen door. Well, by the same token, I think we should be interested in what goes on behind the kitchen door. And we should also be interested in who the customers are.
Yes.
And who are they appealing to and who are they serving? And is that a democratic act, or is it a necessarily exclusive act, in the way you were describing Per Se, for example, which had taken exclusivity to a point of still sneering at you, even if you'd managed to book the table?
Yeah. Well, the thing that I always appreciate about the friend who I just mentioned, who my husband married, he was the maitre d' at Danielle for a long time, and he knew who he was serving. So in his service, I've always appreciated this about him tremendously. His name's John Winterman, and he's just been in service for a very long time. He made a point of finding the customers who he knew this was the only time they were ever going to be there, that they had saved up all of their money and they were going to have a blowout kind of dinner, and they were maybe nervous about how they were dressed, and he made a point of making them the VIP for the night, sitting them next to Mick Jagger, sitting them next to whoever. So like, you are not the table that is shunted off to the corner. We're going to put you front and center next to celebrities. We are going to give you perhaps even better treatment. And he can do that because he remembers he is from Indiana. And he grew up going to taverns. He grew up going to all of these things. And this is why I thoroughly appreciate front of house so very much, because front of house, people see them as the people who are the gatekeepers and sneering, and there definitely is a lot of that. But a lot of them couldn't afford to eat at the restaurants that they work in. Most back of house people sure could not. And I think that is, I like the subversive act of that, like, really tremendously. So I'd gotten the sign that we were winding down on this, but I want to say that I really appreciated last night your ability to bring together US and UK audiences in our hatred, maybe hatred isn't the right word or whatever, of Piers Morgan. And
so to explain, there is a moment. Shall I describe what this is?
Yes, please do.
There is a moment right at the top of the show where, and actually this is one of those points, when I say that I use PowerPoint, people go, you do a PowerPoint presentation? No, I use it in a video wall sort of way. Yeah. And so I go on and I say, one of the issues of doing a show about Last Suppers is you could be accused of gallows humour, making jokes about people who are actually alive as if you wish they were dead. And as I'm saying this, I'm flashing up images of people that I know audiences,
various politicians,
would be very happy. So it had to be changed for New York, because the ones in the UK were a columnist called Katie Hopkins, who I'm sure...
Oh, she's terrible.
Yeah, she is terrible. But I did change her to Rudy Giuliani. And then in the UK, it's a guy called Toby Young. And
yes. You took over for him on Top Chef, I believe.
Yes, I did. Well, no, he did one series or something on Top Chef, and I did Top Chef Masters. Okay. And then, so that was changed to Mitch McConnell. But I left the image of Piers Morgan with Donald Trump, and that played on both sides of the Atlantic.
I really appreciated that. As again, former CNN person, I actually worked somewhere where I on a mezzanine where I'd sort of look down and see him floating around. And we had, and part of my job there was to talk to various of the anchors about food. And I wasn't the one who actually did this interview, and he was just blustering forth about sort of all of these things. And it was before he's gotten quite as bad as he is. But
the curious thing is,
Yeah.
I'm honest, he's had an interesting career at various times. When he was editor of the Daily Mirror, it's a tabloid, but it's a left of centre tabloid in the UK, and he did some very, very good campaigning stuff. Likewise, I was quite impressed when he was on CNN in the US with his willingness to take on the gun lobby.
That was the thing that I truly appreciated.
And he did it,
Yeah.
even knowing, I think, that eventually it would get him sacked. Oh, various things got him sacked, but that would have contributed towards it, this antithesis towards him that built up. And yet, despite the good things, he does still manage.
Oh.
I mean, his behaviour over Meghan Markle, for example.
Oh, it was disgusting.
Has continued to be repulsive. Anyway, I'm blocked by him on Twitter, so that's
Oh,
a badge
where
of...
that is a-
I'm blocked by him and by Toby Young.
Congratulations.
And Katie Hopkins has been thrown off Twitter. So, the world...
Oh,
there
I
are
didn't
good
realize.
things. There are good things
That
going on
is
in the world.
Really, truly spectacular.
Isn't it?
Yeah. I also want to say that I appreciate the rigor that you put into everything you do, and your appreciation of various American foods. That really, the fact that you went to the trouble of or maybe it's the pleasure of going out with oyster farmers and all
Well,
of
I
that.
thought it was interesting that when I thought back on, because there's a whole chapter on oysters in the book. It's one of the early chapters.
And I love Irish oysters best,
Yeah.
by the way.
Well, I just realised that actually the US approach to oysters is quite thrilling.
Yeah.
And I was in San Francisco and Seattle, and then knew I had to go to New Orleans and down onto the bay, across the bay to the Grand Isle.
Which is neither grand nor not, as you said.
Yeah, not very grand and not really an isle. But I do believe, as a journalist, you need to report.
Yes.
You can write off the top of your head, but it will only get you so far. And also, maybe it's paranoia. Maybe I don't think everything I have to say is very interesting. So the solution to that is have a full notebook. It's still sitting here, the full notebook. Never got it back in my pocket. Have a full notebook and stuff. Reporting will always be your friend. I've just written a piece for the Times, actually, the New York Times.
I'm excited about
which is about looking at the literature around death row.
Yes.
Which is rather unique. You can't be rather unique. It seems to be that only the US has an interest in the last meal.
Well, we probably kill more people than other places.
Well, you don't actually. There are many that are much more prolific. There are 50 countries, over 50 countries around the world that have an active death penalty, but only the US obsesses about the last meal. And
what do you chalk that up to?
A number of things. One, I think, is probably that most of the other countries that have the death penalty are repressive countries and therefore do not have a free media enabled to actually report that sort of thing. There is a highly developed true crime culture in the media here, and they see it as an extension of that.
Yes.
And that's part of it. But I think it was put to me by one particular researcher as being a vestigial stump of the times when executions were a public event.
Oh, people would bring picnics.
Which actually isn't unique to the US, but it had stopped happening in the UK and in France, for example, I think before the US. It ended in the 1930s here. And so what we're left with is you can't watch the act. It's all taken indoors and behind walls. But it is that we're left with being able to look at what they had for their last meal. And it's an interesting subject. But at one point I was talking to one of the editors who said, "Oh my, reporting by a restaurant critic." And I'd say, I have been a reporter for a very long time.
Oh my God. Yeah, it's the sort of constant justify your existence. What are you doing? We are fundamentally the best food journalists I know are journalists. And so many of us write about other things as well,
Yeah.
and you write fiction as well. I'm actually very curious about this novel that you wrote some years back, which is a satirical novel, but it starts off with a chef killing himself over.
So the book is called The Apologist, and it's about a man who decides to apologize for everything he's ever done wrong, and he becomes so good at it. He's appointed chief apologist to the United Nations to travel the world apologizing for slavery and colonialism. It's broad satire, published in 2004. But yes, it does begin with an apparent suicide of a chef who appears to take umbrage at a review. Now, it has to be said that within a few pages, his widow says he committed suicide because he was suicidal, not because of your review. Get over yourself.
Yeah.
Because do you remember the Bernard Loiseau?
That actually happened,
and it happened.
It's fundamental to
it happened
what I do.
after I'd written the book, but just as it was about to be published. And what I found very intriguing was an awful lot of people, if you look at the literature, will say Bernard Loiseau, 3 Michelin star chef at the Côte d'Or, killed himself because he'd heard that Michelin was going to take away a star.
Yeah,
but it's not the case. His widow was very, very clear and said he was depressed.
Yeah.
People kill themselves because they're suicidal, very rarely because of an outside stigma.
Yeah, and I just do want to clear that up because it gets. I try to go on and talk about this when I can. It is not cause effect kind of things with this, because I don't want anybody to be sort of frightened off of writing the reviews and things and be blamed for it when there are so many systemic things going on.
Absolutely. Although you've got to be careful.
Yeah.
So people. The reviews of mine, which get traction here in the US, for example, are the stinkers.
Yeah.
But they are the smallest part of what I do. They're fewer than a fifth of any of my reviews. I do not go looking for them.
Yeah.
But, Eater, for example, is very unlikely to start quoting from my glowing review of a lovely restaurant in New York. But if I cut up rough on a Michelin 3-star in Paris, then they're going to look at it.
Yeah.
And if I go to a small mom and pop restaurant, independent, and it's not working and it's bad, and almost always I will pay the bill myself and I won't write about it because it does not need me and a national newspaper down its back. But if it's a very expensive, hyper capitalized place that really loves itself, which is overcharging. When Smith and Wollensky opened in London, their steak prices were a significant percentage up above everywhere else in London. I became very good at calculating per 100-gram prices on steak, and I still do it.
Yeah, you and Ryan Sutton.
Well, it's worth doing. You need to know what you're paying for, and it wasn't very good, and the service was terrible. And I think Smith and Wollensky can probably take a bad review.
I think they are.
They can cope.
Aren't they I could easily have this wrong, but one of the highest grossing chain in the U.S. or something
possibly.
Like something close to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that they can.
But just for balance, can I say that I stopped off at Quality Eats?
Yeah.
Down, is that on 27th, 28th? Anyway, here in the city. And I had a very, very nice lunch. And it is partly owned, or it is part of the Smith and Wollensky group.
Oh, I didn't
So
realize.
I would just like to say that it is not a pejorative directed at them. I ate very well there.
So, you've in this book confronted mortality. You've had these pleasurable moments and things. I get the sense that it made you really sort of solidified in your pleasure and looking forward to doing it more.
Oh, yeah. At the end, I did throw my last supper. I had loads of friends around. We were in a pub. We played music, and it was all marvellous.
And you played music, too.
Oh, I played, yeah. I hired a piano in for the night. And it was a marvellous night. And the only thing a marvellous night can do to any sane person is make them think, that was great, let's do it again.
Yeah.
I'm not going anywhere, or at least I hope not. I'm 53. I go to the gym a lot to mitigate the effects of my job. I intend to be here for a while.
That makes me really happy because I think I honestly think you are good for the world.
Kat, you charming you.
But no, I think it's very true because you lead with journalism.
It's going to be very, very, very hard for a cynical Englishman to deal with the American earnestness. You know that.
I do.
We're terrible, cynical bastards.
It is my great pleasure to make British people cry, which I do on the radio.
Do your best. Fill your boots on that.
I actually have a very dear friend who I was Facebook messaging with last night, and I'm like, I have Jay Rayner in tomorrow. What should I ask him? And the thing is, the funny thing was, it was mostly questions about Masterchef judges who I don't know who they are or whatever. But the thing is, he wanted to know, was your mum a good cook?
She was all right. She was all right. She was very busy. I mean, I think you learnt a bit about my old mum last night that you may not have known before, or maybe
I had done some of my research.
All right. So for anybody who doesn't know, Claire Rayner was the British equivalent of Anne Landers or Dear Abby, those problem page mavens, kind of Dr. Ruth.
Yeah.
They once met, actually. Dr. Ruth and Claire. So she was very busy. She was a very successful journalist and broadcaster and novelist. And the thing I often talk about is how in the 70s she got hold of a chicken brick. You remember chicken bricks? They're sort of clay pots in the shape of a chicken and the hollow, and you put your chicken and your seasoning and some vegetables in, and you close it up, and then you put it in the oven. Chicken bricks are kind of interesting things, and you can put the oven down low and cook your chicken that way. And she would sort of put one of these in the oven maybe for 7 hours and go off and do something more interesting. And it took me a long time to realise that roast chicken could have tension to it. And not just be this sort of mushy thing that fell apart. Okay. She was busy. She had other things going.
And the book, so much of all this is a love letter to the experiences that she gave you.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
But yeah, my friend was so excited. He was, because some of the questions were, he was, sort of asking rude questions about various MasterChef judges, and his girlfriend was asking too. But he said in a very earnest way, he wanted to know. He grew up in Hull. I mean,
I should be fair. I think she was actually a pretty good cook. She did coulibiac, and at one point she was one of the first vegetarian cooks on British TV. They wanted a series called Kitchen Garden, in which someone not associated with gardening did the gardening in the first half, someone not associated with cooking cooked in the second half, and it was my mother who did that in the 70s, and that's how I experienced the spaghetti marrow, and I'm still getting over it. So.
And you're going to be potentially cooking a vegan meal.
Oh, yes. No, I am. That was, we're doing a non-meat issue of OFM. I mean, it makes it sound like it's a very specific thing, but they wanted to put the phrase Jay Rayner's vegan dinner party on the cover. And so I'm throwing one with a few interesting people who I know. It's not the first time I've done it, I'll be honest. I'm not up to my armpits in blood and beasts. I rather like that kind of thing, cooking non-meat dishes, so it'll be fine.
Yeah, it was actually this particular friend who we've been friends since 1996, and he was the first person to take me to St. John.
Oh, right.
And
okay.
he's recently moved actually out to the Donut. He bought the Music Hall of Ramsgate, which he should book you now.
Of course.
Yeah, it's been such an interesting thing, and he used to take me when I would come over to London, take me to places. He took me to Benji's for a proper fry up. He took me to a place. He took me to a place that is one of the oldest restaurants in London, and it's very meaty and very grilly, and I'm blanking on the name of it. But
not Rules?
It wasn't Rules. It was somewhere else.
Wilton's?
Maybe. They have very good coiled sausage in there, but I forget what
Savoy Grill, Simpsons.
Oh, I'm blanking on the name.
Don't worry.
But it's been such an interesting thing to see him go from tremendously carnivorous. He got gout, and
well, that can change your attitude, can't it?
Yeah, and so now I'm going to London at the end of the month, actually to Ramsgate, and he is now runs marathons and is mostly vegetarian and has an allotment, and he's turning 50, which is why I'm going for this party. But
it comes to us all in time.
Yeah, but to see that transformation has been really an incredible thing. So I'm very excited about this
should be
vegan dinner that you're doing. So we'll move on, unless there's something else that you really want to share about the book.
The music is a big part of it.
And holding it up to the camera again for those who can see it. See this beautiful man's face.
Yeah. Music is a big part of it.
Yeah.
You need a playlist.
Yeah.
With every good dinner. And actually, for me, it became a moment in which I could describe how I ended up as a professional gigging jazz musician, which has taken me by surprise and has been a very important part of my life. But I think there is a beautiful relationship between music and food. And I have said in the past in reviews that if a restaurateur wants to guarantee a good review, have a piano.
Oh.
Even if it's not being played, I think better of any space with a piano in it.
I am thinking of the restaurants where when I actually go to Boysdale's when I go to London, and I appreciate
they do have live music, yeah.
Yeah, I have a haggis and I listen to live music, and it's
that's a hell of a London experience.
Yeah, and it's just become the thing that I do every time I'm there because it's. I think we don't have that here so much, and I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the jazz brunches that you can go out to, and I love. There's a particular restaurant I go to in New Orleans. The jazz room at Arnaud's is magical, and I ended up in there by accident. One of the times when I was there recently, and I was by myself. My husband was coming later in the week. And I went back and brought him because I knew he would love it. A little jazz trio goes round to each table and takes requests. And the musicians are all 1,000 years old.
Of course they are.
And it's just such a joy to have that. It's seamless and it's really, truly beautiful. And yes, this is my plug for Arnaud's Jazz, that jazz room. So with this, there are a few questions that I ask everybody. And I am been particularly excited about asking you some of these. Because you devote yourself to your craft, and you shared a wonderful picture of your family last night. I absolutely loved that, and you clearly love the people around you, and you do all of this. What is the selfish thing that you want for you?
What's the selfish thing?
Yeah, what is the thing that you want? Because I would say, like, sort of an Oprah moment that you really have to sort of say out into the universe so other people can help get you this thing.
Oh. I mean, that's kind of curious. Time is something I'm quite getting time. But I think in some ways, the career that I built, I meant to say so-called career that I built, is an act of selfishness. I have managed to avoid a job which required me to say where I saw myself in 5 years' time or go to too many meetings. I hate meetings. and in a way, although I've, committed myself to each element of my working life, that I often think it's extremely selfish of me to avoid all these things and just make it about the things that I like doing. I've rarely, very privileged to have to do a working thing that I don't enjoy. More of the same, please.
I think that's great. So I ask chefs this, and you may or may not have an answer for this. I ask them if they've ever cried in the walk-in. So you may or may not.
Oh, I see. Have I ever cried in a walk-in?
Or the equivalent thereof.
I did once weep under my desk.
What happened?
Oh, it was... I'd got half away into a novel, and an editor had told me it was a complete disaster, and I needed to rewrite it from top to bottom. Oh, it was quite a few years ago.
Yeah,
but that was my crying in the walk-in moment.
Yeah, it's.
And then I stilled myself and I rewrote the whole thing, and it was published and it was fine.
Which one was it?
It's called The Oyster House Siege.
Oh, yes. So I was going through, and I think I will read that next because I've read all your nonfiction. Right.
So it's a novel about a siege in a restaurant kitchen on the night of the 1983 British general election.
Okay. Next on there, while you're buying Jay Rayner's Last Supper, buy that as well. What is the cookbooks? Our wonderful editor Meg Soul writes about cookbooks. What is your go-to staple older cookbook, and what is a more recent one that you're excited about?
The go-to is New British Classics by, I hate to have to say, the late Gary Rhodes. Gary died very recently over the past few months. There was some accident I think he was in Dubai, and he was suddenly dead. He was one of the original TV chefs. And one of the problems with TV chefdom is it can detract from your own skills as a chef.
Yeah,
but he wrote this spectacular book called New British Classics, which is my absolute go-to for certain techniques. I look to most cookbooks for technique and method rather than necessarily recipes. And on the basics of roasting meat and, Yorkshire puddings and the perfect gravies and stuffings and all of these British, syrup puddings, New British Classics is an absolute killer. Everyone should have a copy.
Is there a newer book?
My concern with modern cookbooks is they have become so beautiful as artifacts with their colour plates presenting you with food that is unobtainable, because you know that most of the time even the chefs themselves couldn't produce that food. They are invitations to fail.
I have a museum of those cookbooks that I never cook out of.
Yeah, and I have an awful lot of them. I'm trying to think, I feel like I'm duty-bound to give you an answer for a modern one. And there's some interesting ones that have come along. My friend Tim Anderson has just done... Tim Anderson was a Masterchef winner in the UK. He's from Wisconsin, but has always been fascinated by Japanese food. He runs a Japanese soul food restaurant in London called Nanban. And he is about to release a vegan Japanese book. And he's one of the few people I would trust to lead me down that path.
I love Romy Gill's A Vegan Indian book.
Right.
Like, that's such a spectacular book.
So I've already seen this book, and it's coming out very soon, and I'm sure it will be available somewhere here in the US, but that's the one.
We've been getting the trickle over. We just got the St. John book, the new version of it.
Right, okay.
Which is wonderful, which is hilarious, too, because it looks like a Bible, because the pages are gilded around the edge, but it is a glorious thing. What is the toughest job in a restaurant?
Do you mean physically? Or
you get to take this however you want to.
What is the toughest job in a restaurant? All right. Of all, I've done various jobs in restaurants as part of my journalistic career. And the one that floored me and that I couldn't keep up with was the job of the kitchen porter.
Oh, God, yes.
I did a piece about being a kitchen porter. And in the UK, for various reasons that are a bit complicated to explain, it tends to be dominated in London by East Africans, Kenyans, Tanzanians, and so forth. And I had done about 5 or 6 hours, and my hands were starting to cramp. And I had a jazz gig the next day.
Oh, God.
And my fingers were clawing. And I looked at this guy and thought, the only reason why you would continue is to prove that you are harder and more capable of dealing with this than he is. And you're clearly not. At which point, I simply lifted my hands and said, I'm done.
Yeah.
I stopped.
Yeah.
So I think being a kitchen porter, and the interesting thing about the kitchen porter's job is, without them, no restaurant could function.
Yes.
If you didn't have clean plates, if you didn't have clean, gastrics, if you didn't have clean pots and pans, nobody else could do anything. So it's a very tough job. It's probably one of the least rewarded, but it's also one of the most important.
There's an Irish publication called The Caterer, and they, in the last couple of years, had Porter of the Year.
Right.
I loved. I thought that was a brilliant move to really recognize these people who are important. What is your go-to comfort food?
Cheese on toast.
Any particular methodology for this?
Okay. So, it's actually one of the good uses for sourdough.
Yes.
You need to lightly toast it in a toaster first, then pump up the grill. You layer on the cheese, and then I think bacon. Some people think this is sacrilege, but it's my cheese on toast, not theirs. Then I'm quite partial to a sprinkling of togarashi spice, and then a good splatter of Tabasco. Put that onto the grill. Perfect.
That is a glorious thing, and I always
now I want cheese on toast.
Right? I was British people on toast. I feel like my greatest accomplishment at my last job, which was a website that was all about breakfast. I had Vince Clarke come in and make beans on toast.
That, the great man behind your zoo and Erasure.
He is my neighbor.
Is he? Does he live here in the States?
He lives in Park Slope, and I was on his wife. His wife has an identical twin,
right.
And they have a fantastic podcast called Stories of Strange Women.
Right.
And I got to know them while I was writing my book about anxiety, because they had the Morbid Anatomy Museum, and I wrote a bunch of it sitting longhand in the cafe there.
Fantastic.
And we got to know each other, and he produces the podcast for them. And his wife had posted a picture of him on Facebook deboning a Dover sole. And I said, do you think he'd do a video? And she said, sure. So he came in. And
so is he a food obsessive?
He is. He cooks
Clarke?
all the meals for the family.
Oh, fascinating.
Oh, he's so wonderful. And
I would say on a similar note, I learnt last night from a friend of mine that the great Thomas Dolby lives here and is professor of music somewhere over in Baltimore, I think.
Yes,
he's one of my great musical heroes.
Oh, my husband's too. Like, he has a particular... There's a question that I will ask you in a bit, and my husband's answer is Thomas Dolby to this question. What is the last meal that you had that made you emotional?
Oh, Last meal that I had that made me emotional. Actually, I think it would have been a review that I did as an act of solidarity with the British Chinese community.
Yes.
Which has suffered very, very badly
Sure,
from misplaced racism around the coronavirus.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided to review a place called Four Seasons on London's Gerrard Street, at number 12 Gerrard Street. There are a number of Four Seasons. And they do the best roast Cantonese meats. And I usually go to this restaurant by myself.
Mm-hmm.
I go there and I have the roast duck and some of the morning glory with minced pork, and I have a copy of the New Yorker, and I sit with my back to the door so nobody can see my shame. And it's great. But I took my wife and I took my son and another friend, and it was the joy of introducing very close people to something that was very close to my heart.
I love that. And I cannot say enough, go out and eat at your...
Yeah, go support your Chinese restaurant.
We have a piece coming up in the next day or two by Grace Young about why she's seen places close over the last few weeks.
Yeah, and can I say, I'm stone cold certain that nobody is shunning Italian restaurants, despite the fact that Northern Italy has, suddenly had an upsurge in cases as well.
Yeah, I was just out in Brooklyn's Chinatown in Sunset Park to this massive Asian market that is out there, and they have tremendous food stalls and things. And I was doing my paranoia stock up of grains and tinned fish and all that kind of stuff. Business as usual there. It was tremendous. I only saw a couple people wearing masks, and it was really heartening to see. And the other thing that heartened me was when I go, I'm usually the only Caucasian person who I see, and there were several other people, and I thought, like, okay, this is
okay.
Yeah, I felt really happy that they were there, like, sort of showing solidarity. So I was putting on Instagram and stuff, but it's absolutely vital to support these businesses because we've already seen some shutter here in Manhattan. What is the last meal that somebody cooked for you at their home?
Last meal that somebody cooked for me at their home. It obviously doesn't include my wife cooking for me at our home.
People are hesitant to cook for critics and chefs.
No, they are. Now, I mean, the reality is that I have a couple of friends who don't so much say, come for dinner, come to a dinner party as we're having supper, come on over.
Yeah, love those
and
friends.
a close friend, Sarah and Charlie, just had a whole bunch of us over and cooked Indian food from a great cookbook, Dishoom.
Oh, God, phenomenal.
Yeah, it's a great cookbook, and they're great restaurants. And I think actually we'd given them the Dishoom cookbook for Christmas, and he was cooking from it. So, yeah, it was great.
Oh, that's wonderful. This question, I can't wait for your answer. Who is the living musician who you would want to cook for, and what would you cook for them?
Who is the living musician I'd want to cook for?
My husband would be Thomas Dolby.
So jazz is my thing, and interesting question. I'm going to actually go for. I go through sort of phases with various people. There is a jazz pianist here in New York called Bill Charlap, and he has the most beautiful touch, and his interpretations of some of the great classics are gorgeous. And my cooking for him would merely be my way to, make him like me. So
That's all any of us want.
So that he would help me to understand exactly how he achieves what he does. And I would probably, I think I referenced it last night. There's a braised shoulder of lamb I do, which is an absolutely perfect dish when you want to talk to someone as well. Because sometimes too much cooking gets in the way of the conversation. So if I'd done all the cooking 7 hours ago and all I had to do was wait for it to be finished, that's what I'd do for Bill Charlap.
I love that. Dear Bill Charlap, if you're listening to this, please. And final question, if you have 5 uninterrupted minutes for self-care, what do?
5 uninterrupted?
So everything, you're not having to look at your cell phone, your family's fine and safe, no editor is calling you for a deadline.
I go to the piano. It's my place of safety. I have a lovely grand piano in one of my front rooms, and although at times that can be a place where I'm working because I need to get a song on its feet and I need to understand, what the changes. At other times, it is just very pleasant to sit and play something I know very, very well, and listen to my own heartbeat.
I love that. That is a beautiful, beautiful thing, and thank you so much for being here. And again, people, this book is a really, truly lovely reflection on food and humanity and in the end, joy.
Thank you.
And go see him if he's on tour. Listen to the podcast. We'll have all of the links.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
And people can find you on various social media.
Yes, I'm on Twitter, where I'm quite noisy, as Jay Rayner 1.
Was the other Jay Rayner taken?
Yeah, there was somebody impersonating me, but they hadn't really put their back into it. I mean, they hadn't really posted. They just slapped a picture of me, and I couldn't be bothered. So I thought, Jay Rayner 1, fine.
Sure.
And I'm on Instagram, also as Jay Rayner 1. Now, on Instagram, I need to warn you, my pictures are anti-Instagram pictures. As in, when I set up the account, it was because I was starting to tour, and my management said, we think you need one. I said, well, look, when I review, I take a shot of every dish. They're not pretties. They are an aide-memoire. I never use flash. I never stand up to do it. I do almost nothing to get good quality. The best you can hope for is that it will be in focus. And that's what I post every Sunday, so that obviously when I review a restaurant, we then send a photographer in afterwards with the list of the dishes I had, and they photographed them. So you get a professional take on them. But I think it's now interesting in the current age to have a look at the ones that I was served. And sometimes there is a great discrepancy between those two things.
Same thing with Pete, though. He took for a while to doing watercolors and drawing what he was doing. It's actually really quite lovely. But thank you so much for coming in and sharing with us. And I hope you have more wonderful meals in New York while you're here.
I have another 36 hours and I'm determined to eat well.
Use every one of them. Thank you so much today to our guest, Jay Rayner. You can find him all over social at Jay Rayner 1. Please go buy this book at ideally an independent bookseller would be especially great, but it's available wherever books are sold, and it is just a great reflection on mortality and joy and really, really fantastic food. You can find his work in The Observer. We'll include links to podcast and just get to know this man if you don't already. Oh, you probably do already. You've seen Top Chef and Masterchef. You know who he is. But please, this is a particularly special book. Please read it. And you know what? This podcast, Communal Table, is part of Food and Wine Pro, where we're for the industry. We are part of Food and Wine, and we are geared toward taking a really close look at the issues that affect the industry, front and back of house, what you and what consumers can do to support the people in the industry. You can find that on foodandwine.com. Sign up for the weekly newsletter, and it has links to some of our most recent stories, particularly relevant, the most recent podcast that we have, but it's also just what we're seeing out in the world. Our editor-in-chief, Hunter Lewis, is constantly traveling, and he has insights from all over the place. Sometimes I pinch it and write it as well, and we and our colleague Osset Babur pitches in sometimes, and it's just something we're really proud and excited about. And we have a weekly word of wisdom from Kelsey Youngman in the Test Kitchen, who is also a certified meditation instructor, and we get you caught up on the latest food news. Please subscribe to that. And also, I wanted to thank our podcast production staff, Hallie Tarpley, Margot Gotthelf, and Jennifer Martnick, to our ever-rotating and always talented cast of audio and visual people. I want to thank Douglas Wagner for our delightful theme song. If there's somebody who you think we ought to be talking to, if there's a topic you want to see us address, I am really freakishly easy to find on Twitter at kittenwithawhip, or just again, I'm easy to find. Hit me up on social. Tell me who I should be talking to. And I'd really be grateful if you like this podcast and want to leave us stars, ratings, reviews. It helps more people find us. It's the whole algorithm thing. And I don't understand it. I feel better for not understanding it. I just know that it works and helps us get to the top of the rankings there, so people can actually find us and listen to us, because I really like doing this. I want to be able to keep doing it. Most importantly, take good care of yourself until the next time.